Hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of Reality Check. Here at Reality Check, we inquire how to conserve the real in the time of deconstruction. I'm really excited today to welcome Dr. Vigen Guroian, who's here with me. He has been professor of religious studies in Orthodox Christianity at the University of Virginia and is a senior fellow at the Center on Law and Religion at Emory University. He is the author of several books. One of them I have here with me, including Incarnate Love, Essays in Orthodox Ethics, Tending the Heart of Virtue, and Rallying the Really Human Things. His nearly 200 published articles cover a range of subjects, including marriage and family, children's literature, ecology, gardening, Armenian history, and medical ethics. Welcome, Vigen, to the show.
Glad to be here, Jan.
Now, gardening, fairy tales, medical ethics, how do all of those fit together?
I've never been asked that question. That's terrifying. It might be just mood change. Who knows? No, probably in all these instances, there's a background in literature and poetry, and even in Orthodox theology, though it may not be readily apparent in Tending the Heart of Virtue, which I suppose is in some ways distinctly Aristotelian, but whatever. There is a connection. It's mostly having to do with what I read and what I do outside. I'm not a physician, so it has nothing.
Basically the outcome of being a true Renaissance man. Is that what you're saying?
To paraphrase Christ, you said it, I didn't.
Very good. Well, I have your most recent volume here, I believe, right? I don't think that you've written or published anything since. Tending the Heart of Virtue. And this really struck a chord with me. So I wanted to talk about this book. And obviously, you're welcome to draw from anything that you have researched or read or you wrote otherwise. But you make a really interesting case for fairy tales. And this is something that I'm fascinated by. So the subtitle here is how classic stories awaken a child's moral imagination. So fairy tales and morality. Okay, how did you make that connection? And when did that happen?
Very early. I think I intuitively sensed the connection when I started reading to my children, who are now in their 40s. Mm-hmm. And I've read to my grandchildren the same. So I wasn't reading the fairy tales to them, even at that time, as mere entertainment. Again, that probably had to do with a couple of things. One, my reading in the Bible and Scripture. Mm-hmm. Two, my maternal grandmother's early influence upon me when she would tell me fairy tales and humorous tales from the Middle East. Mm-hmm. Armenian tales, not just Armenian tales, mind you, but that my mother's love of fairy tales in her youth. She read all those books that were in different colors, and then again, my doing of ethics. I may be known more as a Orthodox ethicist than theologian, though I would characterize myself as a theologian, mm-hmm. Particularly not merely an ethicist, as even Christian ethics has become in this century. I mean, there's very little theological depth to what it appears, for example, at the Society of Christian Ethics, to which I belong for, 35 years. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So those are the influences. When I began to read into the literature on fairy tales, then there was a reaction, because two things, even in the purchase or looking at fairy tales books in libraries, was that the Bowdlerization of fairy tales has continued since the middle of the 19th century. where Dickens himself protested against it vociferously, where retellings are not mere retellings, they're new stories sometimes. They sort of leave out many elements of the fairy tales, which, in my view, are the most important, the most significant symbolically, theologically, morally. That and also the relatively new literary criticism on fairy tales, which is an atrociously practiced game of critiquing these fairy tales through Marxist, postmodernist, feminist, in some cases Jungian interpretations, where the ideology takes over and the fairy tale gets lost, at least the real meaning in it. It's interesting that Bettelheim, who wrote and to me it's a classic, even though he was a Freudian. The uses of enchantment. I'm going blank now. Yeah. It's interesting that he, doing this, 50 years ago now almost, understood that there was Christianity behind the Christian worldview, behind these fairy tales as they were in their oral tradition and then recorded or reworked by the Grimms, for example, or invented by Hans Christian Andersen. He understood that. He was still a Freudian, and the book is distinctively Freudian, but it is instructive. He will see baptism in places that the newer literary critics have no notion of. So, for example, in Hänsel and Gretel, almost every retelling of it leaves out, or interpretation of it pretty much leaves out, the ending of the story that the Grimms worked with, where there's a crossing of a lake, and it has baptismal significance, says Bettelheim. He's right. He sees the significance in that episode within the story, whereas the rest of them have no notion. It's just pure entertainment at best, and they're much more interested in other elements in these stories that justify their own ideological persuasion, whether it's Marxist or feminist.
It's really interesting, though, because the retelling of the fairy tale, along with the changing of its structure, its meaning, or even its ending, happens now as much as then, because you have all of these Hollywood films that, having already done movies on these classic themes, which are already a derivation, now redo those and oftentimes change essential elements of the story. The Snow White that's coming out now is a good example of that. But even the Pinocchio that came out a couple of years ago, I think, was an example of that. And I think any story that is based on the fairy tale changes something. And I mean, I don't know of any now at the top of my head, but maybe I'm just ignorant, picks up on the Christian themes in those fairy tales. So, I mean, this seems to be an repeating, I don't know, dynamic.
Well, yeah, there are ideological forces at play, but there's also the economy at play.
Yeah.
What will sell? Sometimes they miscalculate. For example, with the new Snow White, is it really out yet? I don't know, but there was a lot of blowback on that one.
It was. It's not out yet, I think.
You know, really silly.
Well, one interesting thing though that you said, and I want to pick up on that, if you allow me, is you said that a Jungian perspective on fairy tales, so kind of reading archetypes into them, is not very fitting. And I would like you to explain that a little bit, if you will, because what I find striking about fairy tales, the ones that I know, but then also, even if you look at it from a kind of a broader perspective, and you even extend those stories into maybe like myths, like the Greek myths or even Nordic myths, which are not fairy tales, but they're myths. I feel like they resonate with so many people because they tell archetypical stories. They seem to be universal.
Okay, archetypical is not equated. Is Jung doesn't invent that.
Hmm.
Jung picks it up from the tradition. Mm, You can go all the way back to Plato. I mean, if you're really so I don't object to Jung in the sense that I believe that there's a symbolic character to the world,
Hmm.
to our minds as images of the divine mind. I don't have a problem with that, but people who get into the Jungian framework often are captives of it, and they begin to come up with things that just aren't true, or they only see the fairy tale through that particular lens.
Hmm.
And ideology, in one sense, is the emphasis of one thing over everything else, whether it's weather or economy, and what it does is it reduces the scope of analysis. So you read the world and fairy tales through that ideological lens, and you miss a lot, and in some cases, severely distort meaning. So I'm skeptical of Junging's. It there's I've run into this actually uh, more so with readings of George MacDonald. Jungians think that George MacDonald was a Jungian. He was just a precursor of Jung, and they read George MacDonald that way. George MacDonald is steeped in biblical symbolics, and also, for that matter, mythology.
Hmm.
Uh, and again, also in Nordic tales,
Hmm.
there are many influences on MacDonald, but fundamentally, he has a scriptural and sacramental view of the world. That's fundamental. And if you read his unspoken sermons, which make up a big body of literature, really,
Hmm.
you see this. In fact, I would say that those unspoken sermons are some of the best theology done during the Victorian era, and yet you won't ever see them in theology courses across the academy. And this is very interesting. Very interesting. I don't even know if there's an ignorance there more than any bias against MacDonald, but there's a genuine ignorance. I mean, he was profound theologically.
Hmm.
And once you read those unspoken sermons, you begin to see how his mind was working, what his imagination was. Then you really begin to see it. And that's how I really began to see the depth, theological depth of MacDonald's stories, whether it's The Princess and the Goblin or any number of other books that he wrote.
You speak about the
It goes on and on. Yes.
you speak about the theological underpinnings of some of the fairy tales. You mentioned Hansel and Gretel already, and the crossing of the river, so the symbolic of water and baptism. Can you give us another example? I do remember very distinctly your lecture on Snow White, which was just full of really interesting parallels. But could you maybe give us another example of a sacramental reference or spiritual reference in a fairy tale? One that you particularly like?
Well, you can go into the Grimms, and there's definitely what you might call a biblical typology there, a numerology even. So there are 7 mountains that have to be crossed in order to get to the where the dwarves live, for example.
Mm-hmm.
There are there are in Hansel and Gretel, which I'm beginning to look at more closely. I'm going to give a talk on it in Phoenix in February, where Great Hearts has a big convocation of classical schoolers and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
Really, that story is a journey that is symbolical of all of Christians who go on a journey. And the maturation of those children is a sign and symbol of our own spiritual maturation in the Christian life. It is a profound story. It's also, on a very simple level, understandable to a youth, and the fears that youths children have, that adults find almost silly, but they're not.
Mhm.
We have to go through that we have to go through that fear in order to see the light, in order to mature, in order to act responsibly toward one another. And Hansel and Gretel are exemplars of that. They stand for all of us in that story. Yeah, from
It's
fall to from
it's I
fall.
mean that is that moral imagination that you
Forbidden
speaking.
food, don't they? When they get to when they get to the cottage, which is cake and candy, they begin to eat it. That's forbidden. You don't do that on several levels. You don't do that. That's stealing too, right?
Right.
Okay, that's a fall. They mistake it for paradise. They even say that this is paradise. This is heaven. It isn't. It isn't. The serpent is there. And the serpent appears almost immediately. The witch, the old crone. Yeah. And it goes on. So
that is helping. I mean, that's that moral imagination that you're speaking about, right? So facing the fear and kind of walking or working through the fear in order to get to the light.
Also that we have to be helpful to one another. Hansel and Gretel would not have succeeded in escaping if they had been competitive, for example, or if they had acted selfishly
right.
rather than helping one another. That's important. It's easy to act selfishly in a situation like that. Save your own life. Okay.
So Hänsel and Gretel are Adam and Eve, basically.
Yes. Yes, they are.
Very interesting. Chesterton, what you said about fear reminded me of one of the Chesterton quotes that I remember, and I'll probably not going to get this exactly right, but he said something to the effect of fairy tales are important for children, not because they teach children that dragons exist, and children know that dragons exist. They teach children how to defeat dragons and that dragons can be defeated.
Yes.
So that is what you're also addressing when you say the fear.
Prove that. I can show that empirically, in a sense, but I can't prove it. How shall I? I don't know how exactly. I can't prove it to a secular mind. That's all. Yeah. Well, what are you talking about? Dragons exist. Satan exists. Evil exists. But children don't know that. Well, if in some sense they are inheritors of the fall, then they know it.
Yeah.
Even if you take the Orthodox view that the infant is an innocent and does not inherit guilt the way that you find it articulated in the West since Augustine. They don't inherit any guilt, but they come into a fallen human order and the habits that belong to that, and they adopt them almost immediately. But that also means that there's good and evil for them. I mean, we'd be living in a very different world if there had not been a fall. Good and evil, right and wrong, would not exist in the sense that we understand it and struggle with it in a fallen world. So,
and that's oftentimes the first thing that the modern retelling of the fairy tale changes, right? It's there's no more clear distinction between good and evil, but rather the evil is explained away by ulterior motivations or by some kind of quirkiness or by some kind of misguided intention or something like that. But that's fascinating. So I wanted to, as a philosopher, you have a lot of books behind you. And so I'm sure that there's a good mix of theology and poetry and literature and maybe some philosophy as well, and some history probably. Now, as a philosopher, I would be intrigued to hear from you. If I read a philosophy book and I come to the understanding of a certain truth, right? So I read Plato and I read Socrates, defense of the existence of the soul. Okay, so now I understand that the soul exists. Okay. When you read a fairy tale, you also get convinced of the truths, well, about reality and about the world, but there is a different path. So what's the difference in the path of finding out something philosophically and finding out something through stories and fairy tales?
Well, I'm hesitant to characterize philosophy because there are varied kinds of philosophy.
Right.
But reason has a lot to do with it, and trust in reason. And I don't think reason has as much to do with understanding the world as the imagination again.
Mm-hmm.
So let me go back to your question. Fairy tales are symbolical, and they're deeply symbolical. And I would say that they are. Well, I've argued this case with classical schooling people and homeschoolers that you put a lot of emphasis on Greek myth, and that's good. I think that's fundamental to classical education, for example,
Mm-hmm.
or any education, Western education. In the end,
Right.
if we're being truthful about how and what we're educating.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that fairy tales get the short shrift because we've been convinced that fairy tales are childish somehow. I think fairy tales read like a scripture, and that scripture often reads like a fairy tale. And I'm not the only one that's thought that. Lewis thought that. Tolkien thought that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think MacDonald thought that.
Mm-hmm.
That's the legacy. And I think they're right. So they speak to us the way that Scripture speaks to us. But again, I read the New Testament in ways that perhaps more rationalistic attempts at understanding Scripture, and particularly the Gospels, don't. So I read it at several levels, as the ancient church did. Mm-hmm. And I think in that sense, it's highly symbolical, the language of the Gospels. Is it fire? Really? Or does it represent something even deeper than that? What then is the wrath of God? Is it wrath, really? Is it something fundamentally where we're speaking of ourselves in a sense also? And wrath applies to us. We can speak of God's wrath, but we need to be careful about that because we need to be not merely cataphatic, that is, do positive interpretation, but apophatic. We're entering into a darkness, mysterious darkness about God. We don't know God in the way that God is himself God and acts. So I think that element of mystery belongs to fairy tales, that very same element. Yeah.
Okay. This is fascinating. I deeply agree with you. Specifically, this temptation, I guess, to believe that we can fully grasp God, or even just the attempt of thinking about the world as if we were God, from God's perspective, so to speak. I think that is actually reason for much of the kind of more abhorrent ways in which philosophy and even some kind of theology or generally secularization went. It had to, in a certain way, man had to redefine what God means before he can then re-envision the world with that new deity, so to speak, right? Because man is not really able to change his own makeup in thought and fully, because we can only lie to ourselves up to a certain level. But once we can establish that, well, God is evil, or God is volatile, or God doesn't even exist, or God is just somebody that created and then left the world to its own devices, well, then we have all the right to be the masters of the world, right? Because, well, somebody has to do it. And so we easily then assume that role. So I do find, and especially in some medieval strands of philosophy or theology, most of those philosophers were theologians, as we know, both, that redefinition of God, at least an attempt, and then the redefinition of man. So it's yeah. Would you, if I'd say that philosophy speaks to reason and fairy tales speak to the heart, would that be a good way of putting it? Or am I putting words in your mouth?
No. I think
It's
that's
not a good way. I'm not putting words in your mouth.
putting words in my mouth. I don't think I ever said that, but I understand. I understand the distinction that you're making, but it's not sufficient.
Okay.
Look, people talk about the disenchantment of the world.
Mm-hmm.
We have disenchanted the world. The wonder that a child has about the world is probably nearer to understanding God than the adult's loss of enchantment and rational interpretation of the world. It needn't have been this way. It could have been another way. Yes, it could have. There's no logic that requires that trees can't grow pumpkins, right?
Okay.
Or trees can't grow rock candy mountain.
Mm-hmm.
And a child is just it's the wonder is there that is lost to us, and in that sense, we're that much further from God, I think.
Can we, as adults, rediscover that enchantment somehow?
Well, yes, you can. It's a struggle, I think, and more often than not, we lean back on our reason, and that blinds us to the wonder that the world brings about in the child. Everything's a discovery,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a discovery, and I think it's determinism that takes over our minds when life might be much more indeterminate, which would be a way of arguing for free will, also, for that matter. So yeah, fairy tales, their meaning can't be exhausted, really. But they begin at the level of a child, and I don't think intentionally. The Grimms did not collect the fairy tales and come up with the elements they did and the stories they told with children in mind, right? But we brought it into the nursery. Mm-hmm. Ironically, it seems to me, because on one level, we were right. There's wonder in the fairy tales, and we realize at some level that children are wanderers. All right, and children are the world is a mystery to them. That they have a desire to go through, really, this mystery. Well, so we put them in the nursery, denying ourselves what is in the fairy tales themselves, and offering them to children. Why just to children? Mm-hmm. Yeah, because we've convinced ourselves or persuaded ourselves that wonder is something you grow out of. Mm-hmm.
Well,
here's a way of putting it. A way of putting it. For many human beings in the modern world, they cannot see the stars in the sky.
Mm-hmm.
I remember some of my students coming to my home, which is 45 miles away from Charlottesville, Virginia. And as they were leaving in the evening, it was dark. They looked up at, one or two of them looked up at the sky, and there were stars up there.
Mm-hmm.
And they said aloud, wow, we can't see these in Charlottesville from our dormitories. Wow. Yeah, wow. Modern people don't look up by and large anyhow, but but worse still, we've blotted out the stars. You want wonder, there it is.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
I think that is the natural reaction of many that go out of the city and out of the cities and rediscover it. So in a way, then we rediscovered like the medieval mind, right? Looking at the stars and seeing the order of things, or at least the order that is very close in a way because we can perceive it, but it's also so far away that, right?
Yeah.
Well,
and the contrast between darkness and light is up there.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting is that also just, not having children is one other way of cutting yourself away from the enchantment, because in a certain way, as a parent, you can rediscover the enchantment or the enchanting of the world vicariously, right, through the children.
Totally right. And there are also people who have not been able to have children, or for one reason or another, who instinctively know they need to be with children.
Yeah.
Those are the people we really adore.
Yeah.
They can be childlike. They can bewilder us.
Yeah.
Even parents, they can bewilder.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned that, I think, in your introduction as well, that right, the storytelling can bridge generations, and that obviously means a lot of things, not just that the parents can live vicariously through the children, but obviously it also means that the fairy tales contain truths that are truly transgenerational, right? Well, this moral imagination that you invoke with fairy tales and telling them to children, do you have, as an adult or as a growing, as an adolescent and maybe a young adult, and then as a parent yourself, I mean, do you have to nurture it further, or will it actually help you to understand the world in a different way till the end of your life?
It's not entirely under our control, but it is sufficiently so that it can be nurtured. Because the images that reach us,
mm-hmm.
stored in memory,
mm-hmm.
And I don't mean just images, but I mean that, like the tree that's standing out here, that could verily be a cross.
Mm-hmm.
But things that happen in the world, things that are presented to us through the media, through the local news, which is, at least in the U.S., 90% having to do with murder, theft, and other violent sorts of occurrences.
Yeah.
If that's all you've got, your moral imagination is in trouble. Just as it will be where we've created our own pantheon of stars that are idols, that are our reference points for our own lives, whether we do that deliberately or not, that denigrate our senses, our conscience, our moral sense. If those are the images that are stored in our memory, then when we come to confront evil or are in a situation to do good, we are in some sense incapacitated. We're not strong enough because the resources aren't there. So a lot of this has to do with experience. So it's very important as parents, more often than not, parents realize this. You have to give your children right experiences because those experiences are likely to become a memory reference for how they should act in the future. Through analogy, for example, memories come up in your mind in a particular instance where you're challenged with something. It may not be deliberate, but it happens with us. We have those reference points. We are our memories in some real sense. Mm-hmm. So that's the moral imagination has to be cultivated as best we can. In this world in which there are so many images that are not good for us, it becomes that much more important for parents is to give their children the right experiences. And part of that is reading to them good stories because they themselves cannot have these experiences as children. They're not equipped, but we can give them experiences which ordinarily they could not have as children that will be beneficial in their adult life. Mm-hmm. And that's through literature, that's through fairy tales, that's through scripture, that's through mythology, that's through great literature, that's through great poetry. It's all there, it's available to us.
More than ever.
More than ever, but I think we take less and less advantage of it, ironically.
Yeah. Read least than ever.
It's available to me on this. I go to the right place.
Yeah, that's right.
I've watched youth on this. They're not going to the right place.
Yeah.
They're becoming consumers.
Yeah.
Their avarice is being engendered. Their desire for things that are fleeting is engendered.
Yep. Well, the low-hanging fruit of attention, so to speak.
Exactly. Yeah.
And one of the really striking points that you point out in fairy tales and the structure of fairy tale telling is repetition. And this very much reminds me of one of the essential points of becoming an ethical, virtuous, and a good man, good person is repetition, right? Because what is any kind of virtue other than a learned and repeated good act, right? So, and that's how we acquire virtue, by doing over and over again something that is good. And so we get used to the good. And I had on a previous show, I had Father Ezra Sullivan on, who spoke a lot about habits. And he said that, you can even grow so many good habits that thinking and being good becomes habitual itself, right? And he brought up the example of, a man who never talks to his wife, who's always traveling, doesn't communicate, and it's much easier for that man to cheat on his wife than a man who encounters and connects with his wife daily and buys her presents and has a meaningful interaction with her. And more often, it will be much harder for that second man, to cheat on his wife because, well, he's habitually used to doing the good. So again, you see this stark repetition in many fairy tales, I assume, right? You mentioned the number 7, so you mentioned the numerology and Snow White and the dwarfs, but this seems to be an essential element to many fairy tales, wouldn't you say?
Well, yeah, there are plot differences, but there are distinct similarities in the way the Grimms tell their stories, for example. Same motifs and themes come up over and over again. But I thought you were going to the place where I have gone, not really in as much depth as I probably could in written form, which is the love of children for repetition and the bewilderment, if not consternation, of the adults who don't want to read the story for the 5th, 6th, 7th time. I don't want to do that. Go back, please. Read it again. Read it again. Read it again. We find that to be annoying. And that's forgivable, but we need to overcome that because the repetition is in a way a child is a child's way of thinking,
Mhm.
not at an analytical level, but thinking through the world. And they need to hear this over and over again in order to be able to think through the world, to imagine the world, shall we say, that's out there, to make to do the things that they're where they have challenges, to be able to respond to those challenges. I'm not saying that this is what the thoughts that are going through a child, but they sort of know that they need to hear this thing over and over again, because that's the way that the right decisions will be reinforced, the right actions, and also the ability to know good from evil.
Mhm.
That's one of the things that they constantly ask. Well, is that character good or evil? Where do
Mhm.
they get that from? Seriously, is that a bad person or a good person? And they want to be acquainted with bad persons and good persons in a way that more often than not, the good triumphs. They need that assurance too.
Mhm.
And so they want to hear the story again 10 times, 15 times, who knows, whatever. You think that's superfluous? It's not. Children are not superfluous in that regard. They're expressing a need and a desire to learn the world.
And it's
And
fascinating that they have that natural urge, so to speak, right? That natural inclination. So there is something in them that yearns for that repetition.
yes.
Um, well, maybe even without them fully realizing why. And yeah,
Well, they
that
don't realize why, I don't think. I mean, not in the sense that they can articulate it for you until they get to maybe 10 or 12,
yeah.
yeah. Yeah.
Well, Vigen, why don't you tell us what your favorite fairy tale is, so that we can all start with that one.
Oh, Lord.
Put you on the spot there. I'm sorry.
I I can't answer that question. I can tell you some of my favorites. If you're talking about the shorter version, the fairy tales, that we have fantasy books and fairy tale books that are produced, in the modern world.
Mhm.
Didn't have those in the earlier time. We had these fairy tales, mostly oral tradition. Now, with say Hans Christian Andersen, do I have a do I have some favorites? Yes, I love the story of the Nightingale. I think
Mhm.
that is a brilliant tale. It's not one that is well known to Americans. I don't know about the English and the rest of the world, but that 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 is a brilliant story, brilliantly told. And evidently, according to him, he wrote it in a day. Um, that can happen. A diamond comes out of that kind of burst of creative energy. Like it can happen. Um, and when you go to the Grimms, say, Cinderella, I've talked about a lot, and the depth of that story is incredible. But for the sake of but if you, but I think that Snow White is not, maybe not my favorite, but near to it.
Mhm.
In that case, because there's beauty in that story,
Mhm.
exceptional beauty. The story is about beauty on one level, certainly, but the contrast between dark and light in that story, the whole, yeah, I like that story. I think it's beautifully written. If you read it in the German, I think it's even more beautiful.
Mhm.
Um, uh, so I'm thankful that I struggled with German for years and years. Not that I can do it easily, but at least I can reference. There's a paragraph there that I want to see.
Yeah.
What is it like in the German? I can pretty much make it out. And I know that it's as beautiful as German gets. It's poetry. Yeah. And I think Snow White is poetry in
Mhm.
many ways.
Would you say that, well, could you name maybe a modern story, be it a film or a short story or something that is written in our days that comes close to the depth of a fairy tale? Have you discovered anything? Or is that age really past?
Um, I, I don't know that the age is really past. Well, in one sense it is, because the stories that we have written down now were written down by a few individuals, brilliant geniuses.
Mhm.
Uh, you take the Grimms or Perrault in France earlier than the Grimms. They brought the fairy tale to light in a reading world,
Mhm.
in a world that you had books, the printed word, available to lots of people rather than just a few. So
Mhm.
that's over. In that sense, that's over. That's been mined in most of the cultures already. In my own Armenian culture, same thing happened, roughly the same period of time. In that sense, it's an inheritance that we have to treasure, but no expectation of something like that exactly happening today. On the other hand, um, there are great creators of what we call fantasy literature right until the present. Um, and there are some stories that stick in my mind. If you want to, I think Where the Wild Things is a modern fairy tale, no question about it. He had it right there. Um, and the proof is in the pudding. Children love to hear that story over and over again because it's got the elements that the traditional fairy tales have.
Mhm.
The beasts, can they be tamed? Can I overcome them?
Mhm.
And the child's desire to overcome them, in some sense, order them. Human beings are created in the image and likeness of God, and they want to order those things. Children want to order those. I don't mean order command, although that too, mind you.
Mhm. Mhm.
But uh, put put order where there's disorder or something threatening and out of control. That really speaks deeply to young children. There's the fear, but there's also the assurance that there can be order brought out of that chaos. And one can be forgiven if one has been bad. And the relationship to food is essential to this.
Mhm.
Food must be eaten in a certain way at a certain time.
Mhm.
Otherwise, you go off the rails too, and you get sent off to the land of the beasts, the
Mhm.
wild things. So I think he had it there. I think that may be the best of the last, what, how many years ago was that written? At least 50 years.
Yeah.
That may be the best of the short fairy tales. They come along on occasion. They do.
Okay. Well,
I love
then
the I love the frog and toad stories. They're not fairy tales exactly,
huh?
but I think they're as good as the Victorian creations
Mhm.
of talking animals, and there's a mythical quality, a fairy tale quality about it. Also, humorous connection with ancient humorous tales, the frog and toad stories.
Yeah, yeah. I'm
I,
I'm familiar with a couple of them, anyways. Mhm.
yeah, well, my children, I don't know how many times I read them. Um, but I think that they'll stand the test of time also. So we have our own. I think the picture books are our invention, and they can be pretty bad, but there are some good ones.
Yeah.
And that's a genre that's ours.
Well, you certainly give us a lot to discover or rediscover. So yeah, just for all of the audience, then this is Vigen Guroian's latest book, Tending the Heart of Virtue. So we'll put a link of this book also in the description of the video.
Just explain to them that it's the second edition. It's the expanded second edition. It should have that cover on it if they want to get the. Yeah.
It is the second edition. So good. Make sure that you get this cover.
Yeah.
And well, the only thing that remains really is thank you for your time, Vigen. Oh, this is a pleasure as always. Looking forward to also continuing the conversation outside of this interview. I wish you all the best, and we're looking forward to your next publication, whatever you're going to brew up.